Today, we're going to talk about a moment in music that wasn't just about a new instrument, but, well, a whole new way of thinking. We're talking about the synthesizer and how it gave rock musicians the power to stop just playing songs about the world and start building entirely new worlds from pure electricity.
But to really get just how huge this change was, we have to rewind a little. What did rock actually sound like before all this? What were the basic tools musicians had to play with?
I mean, look at the difference here. On one side, you have things you can touch and feel: wood, wire, drum skins, sounds made by hitting something or plucking a string. But on the other side, oscillators, filters, envelopes. These aren't physical things. They're more like the DNA of sound itself, the raw code for building a sound from literally nothing. So let's start there, with rock's limited palette before the synth came along. I mean, the sound was incredible, it was powerful, but it was also kind of tied to the rules of the physical world. Think about that classic mid-60s sound. You've got the electric guitar, right? Going from that clean shimmer all the way to a fuzzy growl. You've got the bass holding it all down, and the Hammond organ adding those rich, swirling layers. But here's the catch. Every single one of those sounds, no matter how much you amplified it, started with something physical. A string vibrating, a speaker cone spinning. They were all just louder echoes of the real world. And this is where everything changes. Enter Robert Moog. His invention didn't just add a new color to the palette, it was a totally new kind of paint that kicked off a full-blown revolution in sound. Moog's big idea was something called voltage-controlled synthesis. Now, that sounds super complicated, but you can really break it down into 3 simple steps. First, you create a raw sound wave. Then, you carve it up and sculpt its tone, kind of like a sculptor working with clay. And finally, you give it a shape over time, deciding how it's born, how it lives, and how it fades away. So step 1 is the voltage-controlled oscillator, or just VCO. You can think of this as the synthesizer's voice. It doesn't try to sound like a guitar or a piano. Instead, it generates these pure, raw electronic shapes, like a smooth sine wave or a really buzzy, aggressive sawtooth wave. This is the basic stuff, the raw material for every sound you're about to create. Okay, so that raw wave then travels to the voltage-controlled filter, the VCF. This is your sculpting tool. It shapes the sound's character, its color, its timbre, by carving away some frequencies and boosting others. Moog's filter was absolutely legendary for this. By sweeping it, you could make a sound go from being all muffled and bassy to suddenly bright and piercing. That's how you get those iconic, expressive sweeping sounds. And finally, our sound hits the voltage-controlled amplifier, or VCA. This part doesn't change the tone, it controls the volume of the sound's entire life. Is it going to be a short, punchy stab of sound, or is it a long atmospheric pad that swells up and then slowly fades out? The VCA decides that, using a clever tool called an ADSR envelope. And this right here is basically the life story of a sound. First, you have the attack. How fast does it reach full volume? Is it instant like a drum hit? Then the decay, the little drop in volume right after that initial peak. After that comes the sustain, the level the sound holds at as long as you hold down a key. And finally, the release. When you let go of the key, how long does the sound take to fade into silence? By tweaking these 4 knobs, ADSR, you could create literally any shape of sound you could dream up. So musicians suddenly had this incredible, almost limitless power to create sounds. But there was a problem. It was all trapped inside these massive, complicated machines. The next big step wasn't about more power. It was about getting that power into the hands of actual musicians. See, the original Moog was a modular system. It was this giant wall of knobs and jacks that looked like an old telephone switchboard. You had to physically connect everything with a spaghetti mess of patch cables just to make a sound. It was an absolute work of genius, a sonic laboratory, but it was also incredibly expensive and totally impractical. You weren't going to take this thing on tour. This beast belonged in the studio. And then this happened. The Minimoog. This was the absolute game changer. It took all the most important parts of that giant modular system, the oscillators, the filter, the amps, and baked them into one compact, portable keyboard. All the wiring was already done inside. This wasn't a science experiment anymore. It was an instrument.
And the impact was just huge. Because it was all integrated, you could just flip a switch and start playing.
It had brilliant performance features like pitch bend and modulation wheels, so you could play it with real human expression. It had that iconic, fat, powerful Moog sound that could scream right over a loud rock band. And most importantly, you could pick it up and carry it. The Minimoog basically dragged the synthesizer out of the clean, quiet lab and threw it right onto the loud, sweaty, chaotic rock and roll stage. Okay, so now this incredible new tool is out in the wild, and musicians started to figure out what to do with it. One of the first genres to really embrace it was psychedelic rock, which used the synth to create these amazing sonic illusions. I mean, the whole point of psychedelic rock was to make music that sounded like a trip, right? And the synthesizer was the perfect tool for that. You could create these floating, otherworldly drones that just hung in the air. You could generate all kinds of weird, cosmic sound effects, bleeps and swoops, and sounds like alien spaceships landing. It was all about painting a sonic picture that was as strange and mind-bending as the lyrics. And a perfect case study for this is the Beatles' Abbey Road. George Harrison managed to get his hands on an early Moog, and he used it to weave these beautiful, liquid, melodic lines into songs like Here Comes the Sun. It wasn't just weird noises in the background, it was a truly musical voice, and it proved that this wild new technology could have a place in the biggest pop band in the world. So if psychedelic rock was using synths to create sonic illusions, the next evolution was progressive rock, where musicians used it to build entire sonic architectures. Prog rock bands were ambitious. They wanted to make music on a massive, almost symphonic scale, and synthesizers let them do it. They could use them to create the sound of a whole string orchestra or a powerful brass section. The Minimoog, in particular, became the new lead guitar, used for these blistering, virtuosic solos. They were building these huge, majestic soundscapes that became the foundation for their epic, 20-minute-long songs. You absolutely cannot talk about synths and prog rock without talking about Rick Wakeman from the band Yes. The guy was famous for surrounding himself on stage with this massive wall of keyboards, and the Moog was always front and center. On tracks like Close to the Edge, he uses it for everything, soaring lead lines, huge orchestral pads, creating that signature, lush, symphonic sound that defined the band. And then you had Keith Emerson of Emerson, Lake and Palmer. He was a completely different animal. This guy was a true showman. He'd drag that giant modular beast on stage with him and literally wrestle with it, jamming patch cables into it in the middle of a solo. He turned the very act of creating a sound into this raw, powerful, theatrical performance. He proved the synthesizer could be just as wild and visceral as any lead guitar. And that really gets to the heart of it. For these musicians, a synthesizer wasn't just another keyboard. As one source put it so perfectly, they were not just instruments, they were tools for sonic architecture. They were the blueprints, the bricks, and the mortar for building entire new musical universes from scratch. You know, the great synthesizer shift did way more than just change rock and roll. It completely changed our relationship with sound itself. It proved that music didn't have to just be an imitation of the physical world. And it leaves us with this incredible, lingering question. What does music really sound like when the only limit is your own imagination?